In this video, I was trying to think of a pithy introduction that I could go with. But honestly, when you consider the EMH, you really begin to consider that in the history of many worlds, there have always been disposable entities. They do the dirty work. They do the work that no one else wants to because it's too difficult or too hazardous. So an army of EMHs, of holograms, all disposable, you don't have to think about their welfare. You don't have to think about how they feel. It's just generations upon generations of disposable people. Unlike previous episodes, this one will not be a scene-by-scene breakdown. Unfortunately, a large part of the Voyager episode, Author, has very little to do with what it is trying to dissect. That is, the argument of whether a hologram has rights. The scenes are so short, the argument's so basic, that it's hard to do this without putting my own spin on it, and there's so little to work with, but I will try. Ultimately, the episode synopsis is that the Doctor creates a holonovel that is slanderous to the crew of Voyager. Before he realizes how egregious his work is, he talks with a publisher who distributes the work and then claims it as their own. If this wasn't the Voyager writers taking swipes at CBS and Paramount, I honest to God don't know what is. To the credit of the writers, they actually addressed most of the concerns that I had when I thought about this episode before rewatching it. The crux of the case is that the Doctor doesn't have rights and thus can't stop the publisher. The counter to that argument is that if the Doctor doesn't have rights, he couldn't have signed any agreements. He's property. The problem is they want to fight for holographic rights, not admit that the Doctor isn't able to. However, this is probably where you have to take into account that they're trying to make drama for a show versus what legally would happen. I'm pretty sure in reality, the crew of Voyager would have been able to do both of these arguments. They could have submitted a motion to add the argument of the Doctor being property as a secondary defense, and the first being that he is a person. Then, if the Arbiter didn't consider the Doctor a person, they could just claim that he is the property of Voyager. Or they could argue the rights of the Doctor, and if the crew of Voyager fails, Starfleet Command could argue on an appeal that the crew of Voyager didn't actually own Voyager and thus wouldn't have the ability to argue those points. However, we wouldn't have the drama if they did it how the law actually works, so we won't be looking at those as options. Analyzing the case proper, the argument of the publisher is that another hologram already makes children's stories, a TARG. He claims that this hologram doesn't claim to own that property nor shows any intelligence, so why should the Doctor? And if we accept that the TARG doesn't have creative works, this would mean the same for the Doctor. And again, the crew does consider just stating that the Doctor is property, but it's dismissed because they want to fight for holographic rights. When we look on the side of the Doctor and his defense, it's stated point blank that holograms have no legal rights. This is in law. It's already been codified, so we're having an uphill battle if ever there was one. Tuvok is chosen to represent the Doctor, and honestly, he does have an interesting argument. Ultimately, Tuvok questions the publisher about the work made by the Doctor. He ignores everything about the TARG and it's never brought up again. He does get the publisher to admit that the Doctor's work is creative, it's an original piece. The Vulcan then quotes the constitutional rights of every Federation citizen. That is, Section 7 Gamma of the 12th Guarantee defines an artist as a person who creates an original work. Artists have specific protections and rights, and since the Doctor has created something original, should be afforded these protections. Personally, I'd love to know what protections artists get. Given the inferences that the Federation may actually have a wrong-think mentality, the fact that artists are protected for what they want to create is something interesting, something worth diving into. But getting back to Tuvok's argument, it's interesting but flawed. The Arbiter points it out, but basically it's assuming the premise of the question as true. It states that a person has the right. The entire point of this case is to determine if a hologram is an actual person. So this argument unfortunately can't be used until the Doctor is determined to be a person. So with the Arbiter pushing back, the case turns to this real question. They try to prove that the Doctor is a person by telling his personal life stories. How he wanted to grow, disobeyed orders, and made decisions of his own accord. These arguments are very touching, but how do we know that it's the Doctor stories and not Voyager? This is the main argument. Why are they so sure that the Doctor isn't the ship? Hell, in the end, the Arbiter states that he isn't sure himself if the Doctor is a person or not, if it's just programming. but would grant the rights to the Doctor as an author, which, by the by, will pave the way for holograms. We know that the court system of the Federation works on precedent, and this is a massive win in that direction. If the Doctor is an author, he is a person and should have rights, and it's now just a matter of getting there. However, when I take a look at this episode, look at this case, these questions, for me at least, this is extremely difficult. The differences between Data and the Doctor is night and day. Data is his own self-contained being, while the Doctor is definitively a part of the ship. In many ways, he is the ship. The funny thing is that we're all being tricked to a degree. The Doctor isn't technically a humanoid. He's a program. He looks human because that's what we can relate to. And that's kind of the problem. He is compared to a replicator and other objects in this episode. We balk at that because we don't personally identify with replicators or machines, but we do with something that looks like a human. Make no mistake, the Doctor is closer to being kin to a replicator than a human, and people do forget that. If the Doctor looked like a toaster and still did everything that we've stated in this episode, if he looked like a comm panel, if he looked like a spoon, there would be far less people calling him an actual person. That said, if he did look like a replicator or a spoon, that wouldn't make him less a person if he actually was. Just less relatable to humans. I honestly don't know if the Doctor is a person. Like the Arbiter, I have no way to determine if he is doing what he is doing because of programming or because he's grown past it. Certainly, there is a difference between the Doctor and the random hologram you create on the holodeck, but is that enough? When does several drops of water become a puddle? When does a puddle become a pool? When does a pool become a lake? And when does a lake become an ocean? Generally, you know it when you see it, but I doubt many people know the exact numbers of how much water or liquid is required unless you look it up, if there's even an amount on paper that exists. I would grant that the Doctor is very close if he's not a person. He's probably as close to being an individual or a person and not actually being that you can get. But ultimately, as I've stated a couple times, I don't know. I can't say that Voyager has proven their case. But in this instance, I think that the wrong answer has devastating impacts. And because of that, I honestly would side with him being a person. I would rather state that the Doctor is a person and be wrong than take the chance that he isn't and oppress an actual person. But let's make no mistake, this fundamentally changes the way the Federation operates, and I sincerely believe that if this continues, the Federation is on its way to giving even ships rights if they keep it up. But all of these are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below.